Welcome to the San Francisco Bay Area Moms, and I would like to introduce everyone to David Bond. He's a licensed clinical social worker and the director of behavioral health at Blue Shield of California. And that includes Blue Shield of California's BlueSky Youth Mental Health Initiative. And David is here to talk to us a little more particularly about our teenagers and some stresses that they might be feeling. So I know as parents, we know the intense and increased amount of stress that we've all felt since March. And it's really important to remember how it's affecting our teenagers in particular. And I'm pretty sure we all know of it, but what are some of those major stressors right now for teenagers?
Sure. Well, I think one, being a teenager is stressful. And so we're talking about all sorts of societal pressures, the world around us, but also just the hormonal chaos of adolescence, and where you can have really clear, logical thinking at one point and then have that completely destroyed by a hormonal, shift. Sometimes within the same day. And so those things are just like expectations of like normal everyday stressors that we have to figure out how to cope with. So when you compound that and you have like the intersectionality of the 2020 stressors, we could also here and list them, but anywhere from election rhetoric in the United States, wildfires in California, COVID, not just the anxiety around a COVID infection, but all the shelter in place and the adjustments that we've had to make to our everyday lives that have really eroded a lot of young people's typical coping mechanisms that usually work for them most of the time. So we all have to we're all working together and on our own to figure out how to move forward through all of this at the same time.
Right. So knowing those stressors, what are some of the top warning signs we should look for in our teenagers to know that maybe they're reaching a point where they need help handling their stress?
I think there are two things really, and particularly for parents, is that monitoring our own levels of stress is usually a good indicator for stress levels in the family. And so sometimes we can exaggerate or minimize our perception of our kids' stresses because of how we're experiencing the stress as well. So it's really to keep an observant eye and to ask the questions about how is this really impacting you, and then sit back and be quiet and listen and observe instead of saying, maybe it's this, and coming up with all sorts of what the young person's answers could be. But we need to, as adults, we need to keep our mouth shut a lither bit more than we typically do, I think.
Right.
But you asked specifically about those signs, and there are the sort of the obvious ones that anyone could talk about with a distractible mood, just a general grumpiness and irritability beyond that can happen if we're cooped up with family for too long. Really even grumpiness and irritability with friends, or when there is opportunity to interact socially, reluctance from actually engaging. And then sort of some of the typical things like changes in eating habits or appetite, weight gain or loss. Although I could tell you, I don't know how many times people have talked about the COVID-15,
right.
Just because of our changing in eating habits. But really that I would say oftentimes, and it's a bit different for everyone. I can't say that there's one set or cluster of COVID-related or 2020-related responses, but it's really, if we keep an observant eye and we notice those changes, things that with parenting instincts, we'll pick up.
Right. I think parents know and hear about that trusting your gut instinct, and there's definitely something to be said for that. Would you also consider, I know this might not be a typical symptom or sign, but what about like switching to a too perfect behavior, like trying to excel in everything in school, or just kind of amping that up? Is that something you think at this time might be something to look out for?
I think particularly in older teenagers, although it can happen across across a youthful age bracket. I think, particularly for older teenagers, there's the concept of, I'm going to be a helper and I'm going to step and make sure that everyone's okay because maybe other people aren't as resilient as I am. When in some ways, maybe there's some truth to that, but oftentimes people can do that as a way to suppress their level of anxiety. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to it's harder to look in the mirror. It's a lot easier for me to look at you. So let me help you instead of helping myself. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out on.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Because and you hear about a lot of teens trying to do good in their community, or, they hear about, it's kind of that social pressure too, of, trying to one up each other to, make masks and distribute masks, or, anything with coordinate a Black Lives Matter movement, parade, not parade, but, a statement or a public statement of some kind, and they kind of up each other that way, where they're trying to do good, but it can be detrimental as well.
Well, and there's a generational impact there too. And we're talking about Gen Z here, and people, young people who have, especially, we're talking about school age and high school age young people. These are people who grew up with social media all the time, every day. So it's a drive to be a part of something. So really, Gen Z has really high volunteerism compared with even millennials and Gen Xers, where not that other folks don't have as much volunteerism, but this is a group that really intentionally says, I need to be a part of this other thing, this other social movement, or something where I'm also going to get really frequent social feedback,
right?
Which sometimes is healthy and sometimes isn't. So I think it's one, absolutely there's something that can be said for being involved and being a part of something in a healthy way, but let's just make sure that they're also focusing on themselves too and what their own internal needs are.
Right. There's one thing we didn't even really mention as a stressor. Well, we did COVID in general and being shelter in place, but is the whole idea then too of distance learning, all of those missing out of those milestones too, and how that, is even another stressor. If you don't have a teen in your life, you might not be thinking about those kinds of issues, but I have a 13 and a 15-year-old, and so they're very high in our family's conversations. So definitely.
I have a niece who began her senior year of high school this year. She's in Illinois, and it's all distance learning. So that meant no homecoming, at least for the first semester. There's no in-person classes, there's no homecoming and no pep rallies, and there weren't any football games, and a lot of those sort of rites of passage of being a teen that we're going to have to figure out alternatives for.
That's right.
And one, recognize the loss and respect the loss and feel sad about it. And then work on what will help me to feel better. We shouldn't pretend we're not sad about it.
Right.
We should accept the loss, but there's always got to be a replacement of some kind.
Sure. Well, and then that actually leads me to my next question, so acknowledging that loss. But what are some of the other ways that parents, caregivers, or any caring adult in a teen's life, what are some ways they can help teens cope with these stresses?
Yeah. Coping is a daily activity is what I would have to start with too. That there's no such thing as a treatment for the way that we feel that's going to be a one-dose solution to anything. So I think parents, one, allow yourself a little relief in the stress of feeling that you have to fix everything all the time, every day. And the second piece of it is, as adults who have interaction with the young people, we cannot say, I thought we dealt with this last week, because that's not a thing. So I think every day is a real conversation with not trying to guess what's going to help our young people feel better, but really having that mutual conversation and problem solving together. And if it takes a while, then it does. But I think really there's something to be said for play. And no matter how old we are, even as adults, play is necessary for wellness. So whether it's being playful and joking around and being silly and singing, that's one thing. Whether you are engaged in athletic opportunities, great, or even games with the family, it's something that's not work and not focused on the things that are happening on the news.
Right. Right. Yeah, I know when everything first happened personally, I remember going to the store and, kind of loading up on supplies like everybody else. But one thing I made sure to include in the shopping cart was coloring books and crayons.
Yeah.
Everybody I know became puzzle experts in that. But it was having an outlet and kind of connecting with that child. And like you said, with that sense of play. And I think it's also calming for the adults too, just to know it's going to be okay. We'll get through it. It just kind of brings you back to those childhood feelings and kind of reconnects. So that was fun.
You're right, and especially creative play that doesn't have rules. So it's one thing, play games with your kids, absolutely. But games have rules, and there are winners and losers to most games. When you talk about creative play, especially with smaller children, younger children, it's coloring without a coloring book, so that it's drawing, or block building, or figurine action play, or cooperative play, because young people. Well, all people really, but I think especially when you're talking about some of that creative narrative play, they communicate everything that's going on in their head. There's, I tell young, I'll just be sort of candid with this one too. A young woman in my family, we were talking about her dating life. And I said, if you really want to understand a whole lot of who this person is, watch him play sports. And it was like, what comes out in sport? Is it like a quick to be like angry and frustrated, or is it like, hey, my bad, I'll help you up next time? And it's like, so you see some of those changes in behaviors, whether it's creative play or sports or athletics, it's like all of it comes out in how we play with each other.
Right. That's good insight. That is excellent. Any other advice for parents as we navigate this, or looking forward, things we should be thinking about, focusing on with our teens?
Yes, I think just as they tell us on airplanes, you put your own mask on before you help your child. If you're not taking care of your parents' mental wellness and well-being is a really strong indication of how well their kids are doing. Okay. So definitely take time to take care of yourself in ways that are helping you to feel better and helping your family to feel better. And then also, the truth of it is, most parents are doing better than they think they are through all of this. I mean, everyone's new baseline stress is higher, which means a little crisis spikes up, like a little poke can spike us into crisis easier because our baseline stress is higher. Mm-hmm. So I think the most important thing for all of us to remember to do is be patient with ourselves and with our family members that we love. And even when you're angry and you have to, or if you have to engage in discipline with your children, to remember starting with, I love you and I'm mad right now and we're going to get through this and we're both very stressed out, but I still have to set this limit. Or, so I think it's really just the constant reminder of patience. And then also schedule moments of joy with your family. We schedule our work days. A lot of us are working from home, but actually put time in. If you actually put time in the schedule to calendar experiences of playfulness or games or just conversations or even just watching TV together, if that's what it is, make sure that it gets done and not overlooked.
Right. That's great. For teens who are at the point where they might need some professional help during this time, what kinds of resources are out there for them? What are some effective things, ways to seek help?
There are a lot. I'm glad that you asked that one too. So you mentioned BlueSky at the very beginning, and Blue Shield California is very excited to be part of this initiative. And anybody who's interested in learning more about it, please feel free to go to blueshieldca.com/bluesky. And it's a program that really engages young people in mental health services at the group setting, and they can engage digitally as well. Not all young people who need help need professional help. Many young people who need help need peer level help. So it's really making sure that folks have access to other young people. But when there is a point when parents and or the young folks and their young people in their family need that additional support, you can always check with if you have health insurance, look at the number in the back of your card and say, hey, I could use at least some psychotherapeutic consultation for my teenager or my child. Also, would check in with the school. The school usually has tons of resources for linking people up to mental health services that are local to you and that your school already has a relationship with.
Excellent. That's great.
And as a crisis resort, there's a crisis text line, which is a national crisis text line where young people don't even, there's also like, there's, national hotlines as well, or even like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, for example, which is 24/7 on the phone. But young people often have have text conversations that are just as meaningful as voice conversations are to old people. So crisis text line is a good 24/7. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you just gotta talk to somebody, no one else is awake. Then you can go ahead and text start to that number. I wish I had the number memorized right now, but if you just Google crisis text line, I'm sure it'll be the first one that pops up.
That's great. That's an excellent point. When teenagers especially are doing a lot of communication through text messaging, that they should, if that's means that they prefer, that they can, there are, alternatives, they can seek help out in that way too. And I know sometimes it's a safety concern, if it was even like an abusive situation or, something, that's kind of beyond what we're talking about here today, but, having that, that quiet conversations with somebody who can help you is just as important as telehealth or, the old fashioned going to, the psychologist and sitting on the couch and, and there's lots of ways to get your feelings across.
Yeah. Lately, more people are going to a psychologist and sitting on their own couch.
That's right.
Using telebehavioral health.
Yeah.
It's really been a fascinating transition. I mean, even here at Blue Shield, there's been a massive transition from in-person therapy appointments to digital platforms and even phone conversations with therapists.
Do you think that that's something that will stick after all of this?
I do.
Yeah.
I really do, and particularly for millennials and Gen Z young people. Millennials are used to getting immediate access to all pieces of information that they need, and don't even, in many situations, don't even want to wait for a PCP appointment. Why would I wait for an appointment with someone when I can go right into urgent care?
Mm-hmm.
Although we definitely recommend having a relationship with primary care.
Right.
I think now everyone's going to be accustomed to, but I have immediate access to even my therapist through these digital platforms. Why would we take that away? There's a saying, nothing will ever be like it was. Everything will always just continue to evolve.
Yep, that's right. That's very true. And I guess that's a very healthy way to look at everything too, is to be looking forward and to be looking at the possibilities and what is out there and how to get to that point. So Excellent.
Exactly.
Anything else you'd like to add? I think it was a great conversation, so I really appreciate that.
Well, I can tend to be very verbose, so I could probably go on for another 30 minutes. I'll go ahead and stop. I'll go ahead and I'll just pause where I am now. But I really applaud. Everyone is working really hard. Levels of stress wax and wane, and we don't really know what to expect. And so let's continue to tread water together and take care of ourselves and those around us, and as much as we possibly can.